If you're anything like me and your focus hasn't been on Asian history, you may have vaguely heard of the First Sino-Japanese War. The aftermath of the war ushered in a new era for China, Japan, and the presence of European powers in Asia, as the balance of power shifted. But what's fascinating is that the war was fought over the Korean peninsula, and there were so many power dynamics, intricacies, and conflicting political interests going on that it makes for a fascinating story to analyze the geopolitical situation of Korea in combination with the Japanese and Chinese Empire, the decades preceding this war. Without further ado, I present you a modest overview of Sino-Korean relations combined with Japan pursuing its own interests in the region, all leading up to the Sino-Japanese War. When Japan was opened up by Matthew Perry's notorious gunboat diplomacy in 1854, the country had embarked on an entirely different path than China. This push from the outside had caused a large-scale revolution and a successful attempt to restore the practical abilities and consolidate the political system under the Emperor of Japan, Meiji, in 1868. A group of modern reformers such as Kido Takayoshi and Mori Arinori issued a policy of modernization and westernization. This movement was much stronger than the Chinese self-strengthening movement, which took place around the same time. The goal of the reformers was to develop a modern education system and a powerful military apparatus. Most importantly, however, was a large-scale industrial modernization, which was financed through taxes from the agrarian sector. The first confrontation any country had with modernized Japan was China, when it got into a dispute with Japan over Korea. Now, Japan and Korea had a history going back centuries. One of the most telling events was that at the end of the 16th century, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the second great unifier of Japan, invaded Korea. After all, from Japan's viewpoint, Korea was seen as either a bridge to the mainland or the spear that could penetrate Japan's heart. The northern part of Korea had been incorporated in the Chinese Han Empire ages ago. In 108 before Christ, Pyongyang housed the Chinese commandery, which remained an outpost for over 4 centuries. It wasn't until the 7th century that Korea was unified. Its culture was more or less modeled after China. Whereas Vietnam was influenced by Southeast Asian cultural elements, Korea adopted all of its major features from Chinese culture. As such, it became China's foremost tributary state, regardless of the language and historical difference, not to mention the vigorous sense of their separate identity. Combine these with cultural aspects, a very deeply rooted urge of political conservatism that was prevalent in Korean society. This political conservatism can be seen in the 2 dynasties that ruled Korea in its history. The Goryeo dynasty that reunified Korea back in 935. This dynasty lasted for 474 years, and its successor, the Joseon dynasty, which lasted from 1392 to 1910, a period that is nearly as long as the Chinese Ming and Qing dynasties combined. Fate had it that Korea's geography wasn't a real advantage to the peninsula. It lay at the crossroads where China, Japan, and Russia met and clashed multiple times. The Chinese imperial system and tributary system put its mark on Korea. For hundreds of years, the only foreign interaction Korea had was sending tribute to China, and very rarely to Japan. Virtually every Korean king was hostile to European explorers, just like the Chinese and Japanese, by the way. Japan and China eventually caved in to the European powers, which did not happen by diplomatic means. Well, gunboat diplomatic means. Korea was dubbed the Hermit Kingdom for adhering to their policy of seclusion, until it nearly was too late for them to participate in diplomacy at all. We'll leap to the 1860s, when the Korean state was met by both domestic and foreign challenges. Both China and Japan had faced similar challenges years previously. We'll start with the religious element, as Catholic Christianity reached Korea via the Jesuits of Beijing. These writings became known as Western learning. Smuggled across the border, Catholics and its missionaries were persecuted in Korea. It was coined a foreign menace and heterodox sect. Automatically, Christianity became an underground society, and Chinese and French priests were smuggled into the country. In response, around the 1860s, the religious cult known as Tonghak, also known as Eastern learning, was established and violently arose against Western learning, all the while borrowing some of its concepts The poverty-stricken peasantry was fascinated by this new religious sect, and many joined it. As a result, the cult spread rapidly. They supported uprisings in the south and southeast of Korea, such as the massive Imsul peasant revolt and Yepilyas revolt. The rulers of Korea responded exactly the way you'd expect the Hermit Kingdom to respond to these domestic problems and Western influences. Christianity was banished even more, and a policy of seclusion was instated. Tonggak was suppressed, and a rigorous program of conservative reforms to counter the hardships the Qing Dynasty faced was pursued by Taiping, or Grand Prince, the father of the boy king Gojong. And as such, the Hermit Kingdom remained exactly that, vigorously exclusionist. Li Hongzhong, the Chinese general that was instrumental in defeating the Taiping, maintained his focus on the ever-growing threat of Japanese power. The Korean peninsula could easily be a liability for China if Japan grew too influential. Korea adhered to its nickname and restricted any contact other than Japanese trade at Busan on a restricted basis, which was somewhat comparable to the Dutch trade at Nagasaki centuries before. The only consistent foreign contact the Korean kingdom had was the annual tribute conducted at Beijing throughout the 19th century. Western vessels occasionally visited the Korean coast due to the bad weather conditions, shipwrecks, and general misfortune. These were subsequently expelled to China. All forms of contact were violently opposed, whether it was trade or negotiation. Among the European powers, this included a certain rivalry. Who would open the Korean peninsula the way Commodore Perry had opened Japan several years before? Multiple missions were sent, often violent, causing plenty of Korean casualties, but the kingdom didn't budge. Meanwhile, several disgruntled Japanese samurai attempted to provoke a war with Korea. In 1873, these plans were thwarted by a less aggressive lobby within the Japanese government. But nonetheless, opening up Korea and draw it away from China was high on Tokyo's list. Eventually, however, this wasn't done through force. In 1875, 5 Japanese warships were fired upon from Korea. Tokyo opposed an invasion of Korea as retribution. It instead attempted to open Korea peacefully. Li Hongzhang adhered to the old Sino-centric concept of Chinese moral suzerainty, but respecting the self-governing ability of Korea over its domestic and foreign policy. He did advise Korea to start negotiations with Japan, and in 1876 the Treaty of Ganghwa, an unequal treaty modeled after the treaties the West closed with China and Japan, opened 3 ports to Japanese trade: Busan, Incheon, then known as Chemulpo, and Wonsan. The treaty referred to Korea as an independent state, and China, having difficulty to translate the ancient tributary relationships to modern ones, did not object. But that did not mean that China did not attempt to keep Korea under its control. The Qing imperial government, realizing opening up Korea may have been detrimental to Sino-Korean relations, attempted to keep Korea under Chinese control. Li Hongzhang urged Korea to embark on a self-strengthening policy, not just modeled after the Chinese one, but controlled by the Chinese. The moderate Chinese reform program was competing with the more profound modernizing influences of Japan. The Koreans could choose moderate and incremental reforms like China, or fast-paced modernization like Japan. Now, there was a third way to make it even more complicated. Both the Chinese and Japanese ways of modernization were opposed by the fundamentalist conservatives like Taiping. Although King Gojong dismissed him in 1873, Taiping played a large role in inciting anti-foreign sentiment on the peninsula. This anti-foreign sentiment culminated in 1882. During an uprising, soldiers and a mob set a Japanese government building on fire and attacked the Japanese legation. Shocked at the violent outburst, both Japan and China sent troops to the peninsula in order to restore control. The uprising was swiftly crushed by foreign forces, and Korea had to pay Japan indemnity. Both Japan and China agreed to withdraw their troops from the peninsula. That wasn't everything, though, as China too saw that the conservatives were the reason for opposition to Korean modernization. On the way out of the country, they took something with them. They took Taiping, who was locked up and held in China for 3 years. Now, the pro-Chinese Min faction at Korean court, represented by King Gojong's queen, was able to gain influence, and a Chinese-oriented policy followed. The self-strengthening of Korea, modeled on the Chinese movement and indirectly overseen by China, wasn't completely altruistic. Li Hongzhang tried to combine Korea's self-strengthening with China's building up its navy and army. get a bit of profit out of it. Furthermore, in order to prevent Korea from being absorbed by Russian or Japanese encroachment, he persuaded the country to accept treaties with all trading ports. He figured, and not wrongly might I add, that vested interest in Korea as an independent trading partner would prevent war. The first success was the negotiation between Korea and the United States, which Li Hongzhang brokered. Commodore R.W. Schufeld agreed to the Treaty of Tientsin in 1882. Well, Li Hongzhang acted as a middleman of sorts. It is very ironic to consider he failed to get a clause in the treaty that marked Korea as a dependent state of the Chinese Empire. The US treaty, as a matter of fact, recognized Korea as an independent state, and other European powers that agreed to treaties with Korea would explicitly note its independence the years to come. These diplomatic relations backfired for China, to put it mildly. Cai Gun was still residing in a Chinese prison, and his enemies controlled the Korean court. The Min family, represented by the wife of King Gojun, Queen Min, cooperated with China. The conservative policies he instated were structurally dismantled. Chinese influence in Seoul became more prevalent during the 80s, but at the same time, so did the number of Western and Japanese diplomats and missionaries that espoused Korean independence. The main factor was Japan. Japan actively instilled the idea of patriotism and advocated Korean independence, Western ideas of nationalism, and reform. It was Japanese liberals such as Fukuzawa Yukichi that advised young Korean reformers like Kim Ok-kyun and Park Yong-yo, the ruling Min faction, and Chinese presence vehemently opposed any voices demanding Western-style reforms. As the camp of Western reformers grew, these contradictions eventually culminated in the 1884 Gapsin Coup. Plans were made to assassinate Chinese-oriented ministers and kidnap King Gojun. Thing is, this wasn't just Korean coup plotters. The Japanese legation was fully aware of these plans. Even more than that, after the king was abducted by Kim Ok-kyun and his conspirators, he was put under guard by the Japanese legation guards. Although the conspirators had the support of Japan, the coup failed thanks to the Chinese general Yuan Shikai, who was in Korea to train new Korean military units. His troops defeated the guards of the Japanese legation and rescued the king. A diplomatic crisis, understandably, followed. The crisis was eventually overcome when Li Hongzhang and the Japanese statesman Ito Hirobumi signed the Li-Ito Convention. In it was agreed that both China and Japan could only send troops to Korea if they had informed each other about this beforehand. This convention marked the end of Korea as China's tribute state, and this convention will be extremely important in order to understand the Sino-Japanese War. Oh, and Yuan Shikai? He became the Chinese resident general in Seoul in 1885, training Korean troops and meddling in domestic politics for the years to come. A pro-Japanese reform movement was growing during these years, facing the Min faction at court that favored China. Now, remember the religious sect I talked about, the Tonghak? As all these events we just talked about transpired, the general misery of the Korean population simmered on. It wasn't sustainable and would eventually culminate in the Tonghak Rebellion. That Tonghak Rebellion was the direct reason for the Sino-Japanese War. But that's a story I'll tell you next week. Thank you for watching this video. And what is a person or event from Chinese, Korean, or Japanese history that you would like to know more about and perhaps see a video of? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel. See you next time.